Now, it will not surprise you to know that we have reached what I would regard as kind of peak plankdom. We're now going to speak to Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday, who must be beside himself with what I can only describe as frustration and anger that everything that he's ever said has turned out to be correct. Peter, a very good morning to you. Welcome.
Good morning to you too.
So, I don't know how much more ridiculous this can get, but it got a bit more ridiculous, I think, with his rule of six, didn't it?
Well, I think it has, because what the rule of six does, and as Professor Carl Hennigan of Oxford University's Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine points out, there is no basis on which the figure six can actually be justified. There's no scientific reason for it, no purpose for it, no reason why it should be 7 or 5 or 19. They've just conjured it out of thin air.
Right.
But what it does is it actually makes the conduct of normal life a criminal offence. It makes normal life illegal.
Right.
And here is the problem which you have with it. It extends even further into what people would previously have thought were areas where the state had no business at all of any kind.
Yes.
And this is the road to ultimately to tyranny. You see the extreme version of it going on now in Victoria and Australia, where people are confined to their homes for about 23 hours a day, only allowed to go within 3 miles of their homes, where demonstrators are treated as if they were in Belarus. I think Melbourne is shortly going to be twinned with Minsk.
Yeah.
The whole place has become a miniature tyranny for no good purpose. And this is the other thing. None of this does any good.
Well, it
so
doesn't.
we have reached a point, and as you pointed out rightly, Kitten Malthouse, one of these supposed libertarians who's been attached to Mr. Johnson since he was mayor of London, is actually now saying people should grass on their neighbours if they catch them having more people around than allowed by the law. Imagine that.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And I mean, interestingly enough, I mean, you would have, I'm sure, read Lord Sumption's column in the Sunday Times this weekend, at which he pointed out several things. One, that there isn't really any point in making people stay home. But the only way that you can actually stop the disease from spreading, literally, is to put people into kind of individual, hazmat suits, feed them through a tube, and have them never meet anybody ever again. And that's the only possible way to stop it from spreading. Given that that's impossible to do, surely the government now needs to look at different ways of managing it.
Well, it has been fatuous from the first to believe that state action could combat the spread of a virus. This is the old Canute problem. The governments simply don't have that much power. All we could do was alleviate it in intelligent ways. And the greatest failure in this was always to protect people in care homes who were specifically vulnerable, who could have been safeguarded by government action. It's always been a vain and overbearing view of government that somehow or other they can prevent the spread of the virus. And now they've become so obsessed with this that they're like a man peering at the world through a microscope. They keep on coming out with these figures about infections and cases, which mean nothing in real life. These are not people who are ill. They're infecting other people who don't become ill. So what is the reason in that case for inventing this rule that has effectively made Christmas an arrestable offence? There is no reason for it, but they can't actually unglue themselves from their microscopic obsession because they can't understand or admit that they've made a grotesque mistake.
Well, I did a little bit of research over the weekend into a bunch of things, including this business of the R rate, because I started to hear the R rate being mentioned again, right? Now, the R rate, as you probably know, is an entire invention by a modelling scenario from Imperial College. And what it does is it continues to collect data on various things and then estimate what they think the R rate is, which is the infection rate from one person to another, right? Now, one of the aspects of it is what's going on in the general public. So, for example, by opening the schools, the R rate goes up. By allowing people to go back into the pubs, the R rate goes up. It doesn't actually mean that it's going up at all. It's just that the model recognises that there are more people out and about. Therefore, it goes up. I mean, it's about as unscientific as you can get.
Well, it's scientific in that sort of finicky way of someone's gathering figures and making calculations on the basis of it. It's unscientific in that it doesn't actually seem to be seeking the truth or experimental fact for any practical purpose. Now, if you wanted to engage science in this, and I very much do, I'm a huge respecter of the scientific method and of serious research, because how else do we find out for certain what's going on? Then you do it practically. You say, how is it that we actually deal with this? You say, there are many, many people who are not actually suffering from this. But on the other hand, they're spreading it. So what would be the logical response to that? Well, perhaps it would be to take the Swedish view, which is not deliberately to create herd immunity, but to do things which don't prevent that from happening. And Anders Tegnell, the man in charge of the Swedish COVID operation, now says that it seems fairly likely that Sweden will go through the coming months with probably less in the way of infection among the vulnerable than other countries, because so many people have had it and have developed an immunity to it. That's practical science, cool-headed, unpolitical, just straightforwardly saying this is what we can do, this is what we have done, this is what's likely to happen. The countries which have been most stringent, which have locked people in boxes with feeding tubes to all intents and purposes, are now the ones which seem to be facing rises in infections. If that's your obsession,
right.
Then if you are so worried about rises in infections, then why did you follow policies which were quite likely to lead to this when the cooler weather began to arrive?
Right.
Because it will. It's again, as Professor Hennigan points out, at this time of year, as more people come back from the holidays to work, then respiratory infections do spread. It's a normal feature of life.
Right. And I mean, I'm like most people, I think, in this country. You know, I decided to go back to public transport this morning. I got on a bus. I had to wear a mask. I wore a mask. I didn't object to it. I didn't like it. But, you know, that's what they're asking me to do. I'll do it. I won't wear one walking down the street. I also have to wear one to walk into this building. I also have to wear one in the lift when I'm in this building. Other than that, that's the only time I wear them. But it would seem to me that it's a bit odd, is it not, that all of the countries where mask wearing has become compulsory are the places where the risk and the exposure to the disease is going up.
Well, it does seem to be so. In Spain, it's most notable. I think people are actually pulled in by the police for driving their cars on their own in Spain with the windows open, not wearing a muzzle. This is the extent of the absurdity. And yes, indeed, the infections are rising in Spain. But this is no surprise to anybody who's looked into the experimental basis of masks. If you wear a tight-fitting surgical-type mask, which you never touch and which you throw away when you finish with it and don't reuse, then in a hospital setting with all kinds of other precautions, you will reduce the spread of infection. That's what they're used for in hospitals. If you wear a rectangle of cloth, which you constantly touch, which you take off and put on again, which is loose at the edges and not fitted, then nothing of the kind will happen. And this is perfectly obvious to anybody who thinks about it. And also, if you look at the graphs of the level of deaths and hospitalizations from COVID, you'll see that mask wearing was introduced pretty much when they'd reached rock bottom. So it isn't, everybody who knows anything about it and who understands the issue knows that they weren't introduced for medical reasons. The reason that they were introduced is yet more of this attempt to spread alarm and fear and keep people worrying about this threat, and that therefore make them obedient to government diktat. The mask is a badge of obedience and assent to a daft government policy. It's one of the main reasons why people like me won't have anything to do with it and oppose it, because it's not a medical thing. It's like being forced to wear, if you were a liberal, or indeed me, I don't like President Trump either. It's like being forced to wear one of those red "Make America Great Again" baseball caps. Right. It's a declaration of support for a policy, and indeed, in the case of Mr. Johnson, a person of whom I deeply disapprove. Yeah. It's like the days when people in totalitarian countries had to wear the party badge, had to wear the party armband, had to fly the party flag on their balconies during party feast days, forced to assent to a policy you don't agree with. It's compelled speech. It's an assault on liberty. That's the reason for being against it. I mean, there are plenty of other reasons for not doing it. It's a repellent thing to have to do. And just looking at the poor, surrendered, submissive look of people scurrying around with their eyes peering over the top of them, it's pathetic to see grown men and women acting in this way, but and embarrassing in some ways. But I try to be pleasant and tolerant, because it's, as I say, from the start, I treated believers in this scare story as if they were adherents of another religion to which one has to be polite.
Yes, no, I think that's the right thing to do, because we are still, despite everything, a relatively civilized society, and I think being civilized is the best way to fight back against this kind of tyranny that you describe.
Mike, interrupt there. Is it civilized when you have the police minister actually calling on people to inform on their neighbours?
Well, no, that's not civilized.
Still civilized where that's going on, or ought we to be worrying about slipping into uncivilization?
No. Listen, I take that point, and I agree with you. But what I would say is that our best form of defence against this tyranny is to be as civilized as possible. I'm hoping it won't come to what some people fear that it will come to, which is kind of civil unrest, where people will eventually say, one COVID marshal too many has come up to me and told me to do something, and I'm now going to punch him in the face. And obviously,
well, I hope not.
I hope not as well.
So much argue against that kind of behaviour. I think people should try to keep their tempers, and that works both ways. People shouldn't. I mean, it's unlikely that anyone's going to come up to me, a bearded fat bloke who's got reasonably broad shoulders and looks as if he could give you a hard time in the street and tell me to wear a mask.
Right.
But one does hear of women being seriously intimidated on this, and people should lay off. They have no idea. And there are definitely, particularly women, who have been raped, who have a horror of having anything placed across their mouths. And that doesn't show. You wouldn't know, but
Right.
people might come up to such a person and badger them to wear a mask. And it's quite unacceptable. Leave other people alone. Mind your own business.
But the trouble is, that's fine. That's fine. The trouble is, with the advent of these COVID, how about this, right? Somebody sent me this today. Birmingham City Council would no doubt tell you that they haven't got any money. They are cash strapped. They can't afford to supply children with books. They can't afford to drive children to school on school buses because the kids have to pay for it themselves. They have got a recruitment drive on to find 60, count it, 60 people to be COVID marshals. And here's the perks of the job. Immediate start, up to 3 months long is the duration. £10.42 per hour, including holiday pay. You get flexible working patterns with shift work across 7 days. Excellent opportunity to provide support back to your local community, and you will get free transport to different localities. I mean, where are they getting the money from for a start?
Well, they get it from Rishi Sunak's magic money forest, where all the money in the country now comes
forest.
from. We're a country awash in funny money.
Yeah.
Which one week is spent
like Monopoly.
One week it's spent on telling us all to go out and eat ourselves silly and drink ourselves silly in restaurants at half price. The next week it's spent on telling us all to go home again and stop associating with each other.
It really is quite extraordinary. And the other thing that I was researching over the weekend was there was a story that I saw in which it said that there's now been an increase once again in care homes, right? Now, it turns out that the government pledged to test everybody who works in care homes once a week and to test everybody who is looked after in care homes once a month. Now, if you were an idiot, you would think that these two things are not related. But clearly, the number of infections and the number of cases has gone up because they're testing everybody. However, there is no suggestion that the testing is affecting anybody positively apart from people who actually work there, not the people who actually live there.
No, it does seem from what I've so far seen that the main new incidence in this is, as elsewhere in the country, it's in the people working in the care homes rather than the people living there, and in younger people and people in their early middle age.
Yes, I think that's true. And I mean, the trouble is that every time the government comes out, I was out for dinner in Borough Market on Thursday night in a very innovative setting where the guy that runs one of the biggest fruit and vegetable stands there has in the evenings now turned it into a restaurant. And he was saying that because of this rule of 6, he's already had people texting him and emailing him saying, listen, we were really looking forward to coming out, but now that we've been told we can't mix in bigger groups than we thought, we're now worried again and we're not coming.
Well, I know, and I also know people who've cancelled holidays.
Yeah.
They were going with friends because the group in this case was 7, and they just couldn't do it.
Yes, but it's not just that. It's the fact that every time the government puts out another kind of cautionary tale, people get worried. They think there's a reason to be worried.
Well, and then, of course, there is a reason to be worried because these things are sometimes haphazardly and arbitrarily enforced, and for those people against whom they're enforced, it can be quite serious. People are reasonably worried, even if they don't think the thing is serious itself. But again, it's quite the case that there are large numbers of people who take all this stuff seriously and who believe it. And as long as the government continues to insist that we are in the grip of a plague similar to that in 1918, those people will act as on instructions of this kind with incredibly damaging results for the economy and for civil society. It will happen. The government has this power. It's created it. It has only one way of dismantling it. It won't do that.
Yeah. But how much further can we go with this, Peter? Because, I'm not going to ask you the question again, because I always ask you the same question about why are they doing it? Why won't they just stop doing it? And the answer, as you quite rightly say, is they don't want to admit making a mistake. But, it's getting more serious than that. I read a piece in the New York Times the other day about Mayor de Blasio in New York, and apparently business leaders now are imploring him to get everybody back into the city, because New York City is actually in a worse state than London is in terms of lawlessness, in terms of homelessness, in terms of no tourism. The whole city is about to fall into the sea, it would seem. And yet he is a bit like Sadiq Khan. He doesn't think that there's a problem. He thinks actually the city can be changed. He thinks the city can do without rich people, that they can do without big companies. And I wonder whether this Tory government is so lost that it starts to think that way as well.
Well, I think they do. I think an awful lot of people who previously had sort of fairly limited political objectives have become, in a way, utopians. They think they're in a battle to the death with the virus. Now, the problem with a virus is it's like world communism or world terrorism. It's not exactly an easy thing to defeat. It's intangible. You can't really do it. So you've got an unending license to impose restrictions on society for that purpose. And every time you're challenged, you can say, well, do you want to go around killing people? Do you want to kill your granny?
Yeah.
How can you be so irresponsible? And once that kind of idea has taken hold of people, there's almost nothing they won't do, because they think they're doing good. Bill Blasio thinks he's doing good. Boris Johnson thinks he's doing good. They all think they're doing good. And therefore it sounds that they think any critic of what they do is wicked and irresponsible and wishes to see many deaths, which is, of course, the reverse of the case. But in the tiny zones which these people operate, with very small numbers of advisors, all with the same convictions, they never hear serious words of opposition. And they never even consult the many scientists, for instance, who have doubts about what's going on. They know the people who are actually given access to the government are, of course, as it was again during the Iraq War.
Yeah. Anyone
who knew anything about Iraq was immediately excluded from this group of advisors. Anyone who understands the dangers of this policy is immediately excluded from the advisors of this government. Yeah. That's how the government works.
Well, I love the way that they put the spin out towards the end of last week, that there was indeed some dissent inside the cabinet, but the dissent only managed to stretch to those who thought it should be 8 rather than 6.
Yeah, it's pathetic, isn't it?
I mean, I'm not even buying that particular spin. But Peter, let's finish up with some interesting stuff that you wrote about Julian Assange at the weekend, because I'm always interested in people who are willing to defend what I regard as the indefensible in terms of the individual, because you've admitted that you don't like Julian Assange. I don't like Julian Assange.
I don't like him at all, no.
However, you're worried about this extradition business, aren't you?
Oh, hugely. The powers which the Anglo-American extradition treaty gives to the American state are extraordinary, and they are prepared to use them. They can require us, under this treaty, to send to them someone who has committed what they believe to be a crime against their laws, but not here. Now, if we try to if some American journalist leaked details of British secrets in British papers, leaked details of British secrets in American newspapers and American media, and we went to the Americans and said, this guy's broken our official secrets act, we want him. You can just imagine what would happen if an American citizen, or indeed any, was involved in this. They wouldn't let us have them. It's completely one-sided. The other thing, of course, is that it's quite clear that the Assange case is a political one. The Obama administration decided, not for political reasons, because they liked him, but for perfectly sound legal reasons, a long time ago, that it was legally inadvisable to extradite Assange, and they publicly said they weren't going to do it. And then Donald Trump, who's blown hot and cold on Assange at one stage, he said, I love WikiLeaks, for instance. When he came into office and became increasingly reliant on the military security complex, which is actually about the only part of Washington which works, when he became reliant on them, he began to start pressing for his extradition. And senior officials of the Trump administration, such as Mike Pompeo, former CIA director and now Secretary of State, have actually openly attacked Assange in ways which, if a minister did them in this country, would make a trial impossible.
Yeah.
The whole thing is prejudiced and political. And actually, the extradition treaty does specifically rule out a political extradition. And all you have to do is examine the way in which this has been done. You can see the Espionage Act of 1917, for goodness sake, a panic act passed by Woodrow Wilson in the middle of a war scare, is the basis of it. And it is plainly a political prosecution. And whatever you think of Julian Assange or indeed how he's behaved and what he's done, in fact, not all of his behavior has been bad. There are definitely things that he's done which I think most civilized people would disapprove of, and I don't share his politics. The one time we encountered each other on in a virtual debate, we clashed quite severely. Despite all that, this is one of those straightforward moments, as the old Dietrich Bonhoeffer warning, when they came for the guys I didn't care about. I did nothing because I didn't like them, and then they came for me.
Yeah.
And there was nobody to stand up for me because everybody who could have stood up for me had already been rounded up. This is one of those moments where we have to stand up for people we don't particularly like, because if this acquisition goes ahead, nobody in this country is safe from being plucked by an enormous hand out of this country and taken to the United States and put in a supermax prison.
Sure.
If they decide that particularly journalists, though it must extend to others, but particularly journalists, if they decide that somebody has done something which they really, really don't like, then they have that power if the Assange extradition goes through. And any British journalist who is remotely concerned about the freedom of the press should be against this extradition, and in my view should be standing up against it, as indeed should anybody in this country who cares about us being an independent sovereign country. We can't allow another country to dictate who we send to them. We have to be able to decide properly whether this is really a crime. And I don't think the extradition procedure that we have allows for that.
No. Well, listen, I largely agree with you on that, but there's a couple of points I would make, but we're out of time, so I'll save them for next week. And because I'm sure the row will still be going on. Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist and defender of Julian Assange, not because he likes him, but because he doesn't like what the Americans would like to do to him. Peter, thanks very much indeed. We'll talk to you next week.